Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Afternoon. Sorry for the delay here. We've been organizing all the last of the equipment here, and it's all working right, at least based on the last test, so, which is a favorite saying at NASA at all times, based on the last test. Before I start the introductions here of our featured speaker as the Pfanstiehl Lecturer, I want to recognize a few extraordinarily great friends to the university and to the Maxwell School in particular. Ken Goodman, who is here from the Board of Trustees, has joined us, as have Howard Pfanstiehl, who is a member of the Board of Trustees, a member of the Advisory Board for the Maxwell School, and indeed is the sponsor, along with Louise, his wife, of the Pfanstiehl Lecture. So the opportunity to spend time with you all is always a treat, but particularly so on an occasion where we have so many distinguished members of this broader community we'll all talk about here in the course of the next couple of hours that are not only good colleagues and tremendous professional activists in their own right, but they're also very good friends. So this is a bit of a homecoming that has been provided for here by the Pfanstiehl Lecture. Thank you all very much. Today the discussion is really about the very theme of what the Pfanstiehls had organized as a focus on strategic management and leadership, and how that's exerted. But in this case, it is a discussion on how to apply those very principles on a global scale, literally on a global scale. And then, to the extent that it's successful, it becomes on a intergalactic scale. And that is the expertise that I think you'll hear this afternoon is a group of people led by our principal speaker here, who will describe some of the challenges of really working through those kinds of collaborative arrangements and partnerships. But we're fortunate to have, I think, here at the Maxwell School is an attendance of four remarkable people who have spanned about 3 decades of time of their engagement on the very program we're going to talk about today, one of the most extraordinarily ambitious large-scale systems integration programs the world has ever seen. And so I could describe it for a bit before introducing Dr. Jean-Jacques Dordain, but I thought more appropriately it'd be useful to kind of give you a visual on what some of this is about. This will take just a couple of moments to give you a scene setter, if you will, of first and foremost the themes of exploration and what each of these gentlemen had dedicated their lives towards, but principally the efforts of our principal speaker, Dr. Dordain, that will in turn then be a description very specifically of the International Space Station. So with that, I think that's the...
Roger the pitch. 7, 6, 5, Roger, Roger, you're looking good. 3, 2, 1.
We are the explorers. We have a need to find what is out there. It is a drive inside each and every one of us. The drive to wonder, to push the boundaries, and to explore. We expanded across our lands, settling new frontiers. We took to the oceans and learned that we could cross treacherous expanses in the pursuit of discovery. And then we took to the skies and flew. But that wasn't enough. We left the planet and redefined what was possible. We flew in space. We walked in space. What once was a melodramatic flight of fantasy became reality. Then, a new generation of spaceships captured hearts and minds for 3 decades and helped build a castle in the sky that is our lasting home in space. We have always looked up. For centuries, we wondered what was on the other side of the sky, and we have begun to answer that question. We have learned that all the exploration humankind has achieved is only a beginning. Right now, men and women are working on the next steps to go farther than we have ever gone before. New vessels will carry us, and new destinations await us. Everything we have ever accomplished leads to this moment in time, where exploration will now take us to the planets and the stars. Our nearest neighbors in the night sky have beckoned us, invited us, dared us to reach for them. We are the explorers. Throughout our history, we have taken both small steps and giant leaps in that pursuit. Our next destination awaits. We don't know what new discoveries lie ahead, but this is the very reason we must go.
This next sequence is one that is very specific to the International Space Station, the topic of discussion that we'll be asking our Fansteel lecture expert to speak to. This is a graphic that will give you that idea.
I'm Scott Kelly, commander of the Expedition 26 crew aboard the International Space Station.
He really is. Right down there in the Detroit church. That's the guy who's on it right now.
Have you ever been gazing at a starry sky when suddenly a bright dot glided into view? If it wasn't blinking, then you've had the distinct pleasure of seeing one of mankind's greatest collaborative feats with your own eyes, the International Space Station. Roughly the size of a 6-bedroom house and weighing more than 320 cars, the International Space Station is so large that no single rocket could have lifted it into orbit. Instead, it was assembled piece by piece while hurtling through space at 28,000 kilometers per hour, lapping the Earth once every 90 minutes. It all started when 16 nations signed the Space Station Intergovernmental Agreement, laying out each partner's expected contributions to the ISS, from modules and maintenance to sharing information and finances. At an estimated $100 billion, the space station would be the most expensive object ever built. The whole world watched as a Russian rocket launched the first module of the ISS into the sky. Zarya, meaning sunrise, was equipped with 2 solar panels and a propulsion system that had the important task of keeping the young station from crashing into the Earth by staying a safe 400 kilometers away. The U.S. Space Shuttle Endeavour followed 2 weeks later, carrying Unity, a node module to which other modules could be connected, and an international 6-person assembly crew. Then came Zvezda, which brought communications and living accommodations. Ever since the International Space Station's first tenants arrived, it's been continually occupied, with more than 200 visitors spending an average of 6 months on board. Astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman at 199 days on the ISS. 2001 saw the arrival of Destiny, the first of 4 research modules, where astronauts spend approximately 36 hours a week conducting extraordinary experiments in microgravity. Their schedules are packed with exercise, 2 hours a day to fend off muscle atrophy, station maintenance and repair, and connecting with family or awe-inspired minds around the world. But they still find time for fun, with regular movie nights and even shooting the first music video in space. Destiny also controls the 7-jointed robotic Canadarm2. Capable of moving more than 100,000 kilograms, it's perfect for unloading new arrivals from shuttles. 2001 was a busy year for the space station, with the addition of Quest, the main airlock for strolls outside, and Pierce, a pier for Russian spacecrafts to dock, including the ever-ready emergency escape vehicle, Soyuz. Then, on February 1st, 2003, after delivering research modules to the ISS, the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded during re-entry, tragically killing the 7-member crew on board. After a 4-year hiatus, work quickly picked up pace with the addition of more hubs, airlocks, docks, and an observation cupola for stunning 360-degree views of our world and beyond. Other critical components included platforms and trusses to support radiators that direct all the heat generated by the station's electronics into space, and solar panels that are efficient enough to power 55 homes. It took 10 years and over 30 missions, but finally the International Space Station was complete, coinciding with the U.S. Space Shuttle program's retirement. The space station continues to serve as an incredible model for international collaboration. This year, 2 people began a 1-year stay on the ISS, allowing scientists to study the long-term physical and psychological effects of being in space, which would prove useful for increasingly ambitious space travel, like trips to Mars. Over its lifetime, we've learned an immense amount scientifically, but also about our capacity to work together and accomplish truly remarkable acts.
So that quick section you saw that cut in right before this really is Scott Kelly, the guy who was caricatured on this piece. And that will be the longest duration space flight expedition crew that the station has ever seen. But continuously since November of 2000, the space station has been occupied by a crew at all times. And this is now the 45th mission or expedition to the International Space Station, currently going on now. So over the course of that 15-year period, it has been 24/7, 365. And yet, astonishingly, fewer people know about that than you would think would otherwise do. I mean, it's an amazing capability. One of our panelists today always observed as how this is one discovery away from being the next wonder of the world. And as a consequence, I'm a true believer in that proposition. Today, though, our leading speaker here, the Pfanstiehl lecturer for this occasion, is Jean-Jacques Dordain, a great friend who was the 6th Director General of the European Space Agency and served for the longest time, 12 years, of not only any member who had ever been appointed to the task and the opportunity to be the Director General of the European Space Agency, but any other space agency that I'm aware of. That is the longest tenure of anyone who's ever been in a leadership capacity in this broader community. I mean, he truly is the anchor of the capability of staying power in these capacities, and yet has never shown it. He's always demonstrated the same youth that I experienced with him from the day that I met him in late 2002 when he was first appointed to the opportunity. He has a degree in engineering and has spent most of his professional life associated with that discipline and field, assigned to a variety of very important opportunities with the European Space Agency, but also with many other institutions and activities, including at universities. He has served at least 3 different universities on the faculty there, teaching mechanical engineering and a range of other engineering disciplines along the way, as well as across Europe. He has been a lecturer at universities in Rome, in Austria, and in Belgium over the course of his career. Has honors that would probably take me the rest of the afternoon to go through, because every single nation state that is part of the 22 nations that are part of the European Space Agency, and a lot of admirers of his, have awarded him the highest recognition of every national honor that could be bestowed. And it's richly deserving. He is an extraordinary leader, a fellow who started his time at the European Space Agency at the beginning of his tenure, little less than 30 years ago, as one of the primary leaders dealing with the utilization challenges of the International Space Station and planning on exactly how to treat that. One of our panelists here was associated with the same endeavor early on from the other side, or this side of the pond, during that time so many years ago, and I'm sure they'll talk about that. But along the way, he also moved through a lot of other capacities, left the European Space Agency, came back to it, and then ultimately became its Director General during the course of its time. And again, is acutely familiar with the capabilities that we're talking about today, as well as just the challenges of trying to keep a coalition of partners together. I would attribute to him in my roughly 2.5 years of time that I had the privilege of serving at NASA, when he was my counterpart and colleague at the European Space Agency during that period, as the most reliable partner of all that we had within the International Space Station community. And that applied not only to this program, but everything else we ever worked on. He is an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary professional, and I like to call him an extraordinarily good friend. My good friend, Jean-Jacques Doudan.
Okay, so thank you very much. I must say that speaking of the International Space Station in front of the two Bill, Mike and Sean, it's like passing an exam. So I must say that I hope that I shall have a good mark at the end. But okay, so I am very glad to be here. I must say that I always start speeches in front of students by saying that you are a Director General for a limited period of time, even if it can look long, while you are a professor forever. And this is the reason why it's much better to be a professor than to be a Director General. So I am pleased to be here. As you said, Sean, I think that it was on the 2nd of November that we have celebrated the 15th anniversary of the permanent presence of men and women on board the station. So it's exactly 15 years ago. And I shall always remember that in the first Head of Agency meeting that you have organized in Monterey in 2003, we were celebrating 1,000 days. So we have to compare the 1,000 days that we have celebrated in 2003 to 15 years. I must say it's a long way that we have spent together. So ISS. ISS, it's a long story, even much longer than you think. And it would be worth a lot of books to write about the International Space Station. It's like a cathedral. And because that could not be that big and that long-lasting, with such long-lasting consequence, without all the steps which have led to the current ISS, meaning that all the precursor steps can look boring and even useless. I don't think so. I think that all these steps, without all these steps, the space station will not be that success. And this is the reason why I shall try to go through the precursor steps before coming to the International Space Station. Because, okay, that it's unfortunately a privilege of age. I have had the privilege to be at the right place and at the right moment to live and contribute to several of these steps. Starting with the development of the Space Shuttle main engine. I was in Rocketdyne in California in the mid-70s to work on the pogo suppressor of the Space Shuttle main engine. And that the Space Shuttle is very important for the history of the space station, because it was not only the workhorse of the assembly of the space station, but it was also the cooperation between United States and Canada. And that was one of the precursor cooperation which led to the space station, and especially because it was the robotic arm for the space shuttle, which has been derived to the robotic arm of the International Space Station. And then I was associated to the Space Lab program. First of all, because in '77 I was selected to be an astronaut, to fly on board Spacelab. I did not fly. I was not good enough. But okay, at least it was my connection with the Spacelab. But after that, I was connected with the first flight of Spacelab because I was in charge of experiment 13 on board Spacelab 1, which was an infrared spectrometer. And Spacelab is an important precursor step because it was a cooperation between United States and ESA already at that time. And all what we have done later on is originated from this original Spacelab program. And then there was the step of Space Station Freedom, which was for 6 years the space station on which we were working. It was 4 partners, and I have arrived at ESA being in charge of the utilization of Space Station Freedom. And it was an important step because it was a cooperation between United States, Japan, ESA, and Canada. So this was another step that I have participated to. And then I have been the negotiator of the EuroMIR missions. 2 ESA astronauts flying on board Mir, meaning that I have spent some time in Moscow to negotiate the 2 EuroMIR missions. And it was good because it was the first time that ESA and Russia were cooperating together. And okay, after that, I was Director of Strategy, Director General, and as a Director General, I have been obviously involved a lot in the International Space Station, unfortunately, starting by the catastrophe of Columbia, because I have been appointed in December 2002, and 6 weeks later, we had the catastrophe of Columbia, and this is when the first time I met Sean after that. But after we arrived to the better days, and we have launched Columbus in 2008. And between 2008 and 2015, 5 ATV to the space station. And that I was there, and it was good. So you cannot understand the International Space Station without taking into account this precursor step. And even before myself, the space station was already there. Because the space station has started to be in the mind of some visionaire like Tsikolsky and von Braun. This is the first drawings of space station that I have seen coming from these visionaries people. But before going back to the precursor step, I would like to say that if there is one characteristic of the space station that I would like just to underline, it's cooperation. This is the essence of the International Space Station. It's much more than that, but it's mostly a cooperation. And as I said in all my speeches, cooperation is a very difficult process. It's always easier not to cooperate. That it's, and I can tell you that. So it's a difficult process, and it's a very slow process. So we can complain about the duration of the assembly phase and so on, but cooperation is always a slow process. It's always faster to go competition. That it's, but I am convinced that the space station would not exist without the cooperation. And especially because of the different problems that we had to cross, the partnership was the success of the space station. And I should quote one of my NASA colleague, Mike Griffin, who has said that the partnership will last much longer than hardware. And this is something that I totally share. And this is the reason why I wanted to start by that, to say that cooperation is the essence of the space station. So I shall make I shall divide my speech in 4 parts. First of all, the precursor steps. Second, I shall speak of the assembly phase. Third, about the exploitation phase, which is running. And maybe some words on the future, because the future is always more interesting than the past. So the precursor steps. As I said, the idea to develop a station in space was born much before the first satellite flew in 1957. Because it was in the imagination of Hermann Oberth, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Wernher von Braun. They all designed, at least drawing, some space station, meaning that this is something which is coming from very far. And even in the historical letter of President Kennedy on the 20th of April 1961, 8 days after the flight of Gagarin, President Kennedy was offering several options to beat the Soviets. So the only objective was to beat the Soviets, that was clear, but he was offering several options, including a space station. That is part of the letter that I am keeping, because this is the dream of all Director General of any space agency in the world would be to receive such a letter, because that was a blank check. There was a clear objective and a blank check for the engineers, which we all dream of. But he was offering to develop a laboratory in space, which was a space station. As you know, the moon was selected, which is good. But just to say that was already in the air. So that was the 60s, the good old times of the competition. But you have to realize that the competition ended in 69. We knew who has won the competition. The US flag was the first on the moon. The competition was over, and nobody was interested anymore by the competition. And this is the problem of the competition. It goes fast, but as soon as you know the winner, it's over. And it was in the 70s, early 70s, that the cooperation started. And in the 70s, there was a lot of cooperating endeavors, which are the precursor of the International Space Station. Starting by first, I don't know if, can I, yes. Starting by Apollo-Soyuz, 1975. In the middle of the Cold War, United States and USSR decided to make a joint mission, which is a fantastic, shaking hands in orbit, was not solving all the problems on ground, but at least it was a first step of the cooperation between, at that time, United States and USSR. After that, there was Skylab, which was the space station of United States. Not so much cooperation at that time. Some experiments. I have put that picture because there was some experiments made on Skylab, especially coming from Europe. After that, we had, as I said, the US Space Shuttle, which was a cooperation with, between United States and Canada for the robotic arm, and United States and Europe for Spacelab. And that you have a picture of Spacelab in the bay of the Space Shuttle. And I must say that the cooperation between United States and ESA at that time was very successful, because Spacelab is a great success between United States and Europe. And so that, and Spacelab is the origin of all pressurized modules that ESA has provided to the International Space Station. I think that around 50% of all pressurized modules on board the space station are made in Europe. If you count the Columbus Laboratory, the nodes, the cupola, the MPLM, all pressurized modules made in Europe. And they are all coming from Spacelab. And so just to say that even before speaking of the space station, I think that some seeds were already there. After that, we arrive in the 80s, and in the 80s, we have the initiative of President Reagan in 1984, Space Station Freedom. So I could not present all the design of Space Station Freedom because I have a lot. So I have selected just one of them because we have spent 6 years of just designing the Space Station Freedom, because there was redesign and redesign. At least I have noted myself 3 major redesign. One in 86, just when I arrived. After the Challenger accident, there was a first redesign exercise. After that, there was one in 90, mostly because of the cost already at that time. And the third one in 92, because of the change of administration. So there is always good reason to make redesign. But myself, I have crossed 3 major redesign until 92. As you can see, it was a lot of work, a lot of work. We were working a lot. But in 92, the Space Station Freedom was still a big amount of paper. There was not yet any real hardware. There was some hardware, obviously, but not real ones. Just to say that at that time, when I was arriving at ESA in 86, the Columbus module was called Columbus module because it was supposed to be launched in 1992 to celebrate the 500 years anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus in America. So just to say that 92, it took much more time. So we are in 92. Columbus was not launched, and Freedom was just a piece of paper. Maybe less known, still in the 80s, maybe less spectacular. But there was an agreement signed between United States and still USSR at that time, in 87, to exchange astronauts. Soviet cosmonauts flying on board the space shuttle and US astronauts flying on board Mir. And it's interesting because much before International Space Station was arriving on our table, there was already some cooperation between United States and USSR going on there. But that agreement did not materialize before the big collapse of USSR in the early 90s, and that has totally reshuffled the space station program. So you have to realize that in the early 90s, we had on one side Space Station Freedom, 4 partners, and on the other side, the Soviet Mir station, which was running and operating. USSR collapsed, and that has given a totally new momentum to the space station because United States and Russia, they have decided to combine their space station. So I would say that it was a reunification of Space Station Freedom on the western side and Mir station on the Soviet side. And this is the addition of these 2 space stations, Freedom and Mir 2, which was Mir 2 at that time, who made the International Space Station. Meaning that the space station of today is just the result of a reunification between 2 space stations. And I say that because I am convinced that if we were redesigning a space station today, we would not make that space station. But at that time, this was the only way to make a space station. And at that time, NASA and Russia, they were working together to make a joint plan. And this joint plan was issued in September 93. And signed on the 2nd of September by by the Vice President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Russia, showing the political importance of that joint plan on the 2nd of September 1993. And this joint plan is a detailed joint plan, including visits of US astronauts on board Mir. That was the implementation of the 87 agreement. And the first one, I think, that was Norm, flying on board Mir, Norm that we know very well. After that, there was visits that it's Mir. Visits of the space shuttle to Mir, that was also part of the plan, and there was several flights of the space shuttle to Mir. And then the joint plan was planning an assembly of a space station, and that it's interesting, from 1994 to 2002. So the original plan was an assembly phase of 8 years, from 1994 to 2002, followed by 10 years of exploitation, meaning that the exploitation of that space station was supposed to be ended in 2012. And as you can see later, 2012 is more or less the end of the assembly phase of the space station. So here we were. I must say, and I have to add that the three partners of freedom were not so much involved in that joint plan. And that has raised some problem. I was on the ESA side. I can tell you that the three partners of freedom, they were scared to have United States and Russia agreeing on the joint plan without having involved. Okay, obviously we were kept informed, but not involved in that process. And that is certainly something which was important and which can explain some delays in the International Space Station. Because the three partners of freedom, they were involved after the joint plan was signed, and it took 3 years for the other partners to confirm that they would follow that move from United States and Russia. So if I say that, it's not to complain, it's a fact, and anyway, it's a history. But this is how, when you pass from 4 partners to 5 partners, if one of the 4 gives the impression that he is talking alone to the 5th one, it can raise some problems. And I know that, at least in ESA, there was some concern and even some reluctance to follow that. But okay, at the end, it was okay. So, 95, we were all set, 5 partners. We were 4. We were, in 93, we are 5, with Russia on board. And this is the reason why, from that time, we could start the International Space Station. So just to see, we were in 95. The initiative of President Reagan was in 84. So it was 11 years to mature from the original initiative of President Reagan, which was freedom, to the real starting point of the International Space Station in 95. So before going to the assembly phase, there was a first decision to be taken, which was with a lot of consequence. You have to realize that Mir was on an orbit of 51 degrees, just because of the Baikonur latitude, while Freedom was on an orbit of 28 degrees because of the latitude of Cape Canaveral. And that it was obviously United States and Russia, they had to decide on which orbit they would make the reunification. Could have been on intermediate, 28 plus 51 divided by 2, but the that was just not possible because Soyuz could not reach from Baikonur the orbit of 28 degrees, meaning that the only option was to put the International Space Station on 51 degrees. Okay, that was a choice. But obviously, the consequence of that choice is that the performance of the space shuttle going from Cape Canaveral to 51 degrees were totally different. Meaning that we had all the partners of Space Station Freedom, we had to redesign everything. We could not take just the heritage of Freedom because we had to reduce or to split. It was either to reduce or to split our modules to fit with the performance of the space shuttle on 51 degrees. And on the ESA side, we have moved from a 4-segment Columbus to a 2-segment Columbus. We had to reduce by a factor of 2 just to fit with the performance of the space shuttle. And that was a major redesign. And just to give you, I was still naive at that time. I thought that a 2-segment Columbus would cost less than a 4-segment Columbus. Not at all. It was even more expensive. Because just to say that the cost of a piece of hardware has nothing to do with the size, the mass, and the volume. This is just the number of people working on that project. And anyway, we had to pay a number of engineers in Bremen and in Torino, and it was the only definition of the cost of Columbus. So when I have learned that the cost of a 2-segment Columbus was more than the cost of 4 segments, so I said, okay, what about an 8-segment Columbus? Because maybe it's much cheaper. But okay, we were bound by the performance of the space shuttle. But that was another reason to delay. So just to say that the delays are not just because we were doing nothing. We were working a lot. But to adapt to this new situation, we had to work a lot. So the choice was to put the space station, International Space Station, on 51 degrees, which is the orbit of Mir. Okay, so after all that, the real stuff could start. And that during the assembly phase, we had to face together technical challenges, management challenges, and unfortunately, we had to face the unexpected. So the technical challenges, there were many, and they were huge. But they were simple. Simple because the technical challenges, they are not emotional. And that is the best characteristic of technical challenges. You take that as just problems, and you are there to find solutions. But there is no emotion in any technical challenge. It can be interesting. Just to say, at the time of Freedom, since I was in charge of utilization, I can tell you that the discussions to have a standard rack in the pressurized module, and we were only among Western partners. It took 2 years to agree on the standard rack. That I shall always remember that. But okay, so just to say that technical challenges, there are many. I shall not mention all the technical challenges. Maybe the first one was related to the size of the space station. It was related in the movies. The size is the size of, this is the area of a football field. This is around 400 tons altogether, metric tons, which correspond more or less to, okay, I shall say 40 parts of 10 tons each, average. It's less, a little bit less than 40 parts, but 400 tons is not very far from 40 parts of 10 tons average, which have to be launched one by one, meaning that we had almost 40 successive configurations of the space station. you see the result. But between that, we had to manage 40 successive configurations. Each configuration being controllable, being sustainable, so each configuration was a space station. So we have assembled 40 different successive configuration of the space station. So that was certainly a technical challenge that our engineers, they had to manage that. The second important challenge was the interface. I have mentioned the standard rack, but we had to organize interface among very different elements, coming from United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, Russia. We have all different standards, different units, different language, and we have to make all these elements fitting together. And because we had to connect these elements. So the interface was another interesting technical challenge. The third one was the coherence between assembly and utilization. And that I can tell you, since I was in charge of utilization, it took a lot of discussion. Do we put the focus on assembly and then utilization? Do we start utilization during the assembly phase? That was an interesting debate, which was technical, but starting with some emotions, that meaning that it was a little bit more difficult. And another technical challenge was the coherence. So I was speaking coherence between assembly and utilization. The other one was the coherence between assembly and logistics, which was related to the crew on board. Do we have to have a permanent crew on board? From when? Because as soon as you have 3 guys on board, you have to feed them, unfortunately. And that makes a lot of logistics. As soon as you have people on board, there are logistics. And that was also a lot of discussions. When do we start to put a permanent crew on board? And because this was the coherence between assembly and logistics. But that, okay, was all the technical challenges. We could fix, I think, that all the problems. Maybe what we did not succeed fully was standardizing all the interface, and especially the docking port. I have always found difficult for me, including as Director General of ESA, that the ATV could dock only on the Russian part of the space station and could not dock somewhere else. So that we did not succeed because it was heritage of the past, and we have developed an ATV which was capable to dock to a Russian part under a cooperation with Russia, by the way, but not being able to dock anywhere else on board the space station. But that's okay. I think that most of the problems were solved and were solved properly. Management challenge were much more difficult because that starts the emotion. And the ego that I was discussing with Sean, I must say that I have a lot of experience, unfortunately. This is just a question of age, but I can tell you that the ego is sometimes the most difficult part of what we have to solve. And we were 5 partners. We had to manage a system with 5 partners. And not easy. Because you have to manage a system at 5, but where each partner is responsible of its part. Meaning that we, in Europe, since we were funding our part, we were fully responsible of our part. So we had to manage our part, but we had to make sure that this part was compatible with the overall system. And each time one partner is taking a decision concerning its part, there may be consequence on the other parts. So that is not so easy. Because obviously, this is always the fault of your neighbor. It's never your fault. That is the first challenge, how to manage something at 5 where each of the 5 is responsible, fully responsible, of its own part. The second challenge is that the 5 partners were not all equal. And that is in the agreement. I am not inventing that. When I read the intergovernmental agreement, so there is, it's not 5 partners. It's 2 plus 2 plus 1. And that makes the partnership not equal. And the third challenge, and maybe the most difficult one, was the fact that the management structure and the agreements were a little bit in the hands of engineers and managers, but much more in the hands of politicians and lawyers. And that, I can tell you, that does not make life, and I have nothing against lawyers and politicians by far. But when you combine, when you are asking lawyers and politicians to look at the management structures and so on, does not make the life of engineers and managers easier. So the result has been a very complex organization. I must say that. A complex organization which was made of 3 layers of international agreements and 5 layers of committees. That this was the only way to reconcile everything, was to invent that. So 3 layers of international agreements. So we had, first of all, the intergovernmental agreement, which was among governments, and which was among 15 governments. United States, easy. Russia, easy. Japan, Canada, but 11 countries of Europe. Each country being a member of ESA, but this is the government who was in charge of, and not the Director General of ESA, who was in charge of that. Meaning that this intergovernmental agreement was totally out of the management of ESA. Maybe also out of the management of NASA, but that I cannot answer to that question. And now each country of ESA willing to join the space station, they have first to sign the intergovernmental agreement. And as you know, recently, UK, Romania, and Portugal, I think, have joined the space station program. So they have first to sign the intergovernmental agreement. And this is in that intergovernmental agreement that we had 3 categories of partners. The 2 first ones, USA and Russia, and it's written serving as the foundation of the International Space Station. After that, it was Japan and Europe significantly enhancing the capabilities of the space station. So you see the nuance. The 2 first ones are the founding, and the other ones are just increasing significantly. And for Canada, they have invented providing an essential part of ISS. That was for Canada. So we had 3 different categories of partners. So the intergovernmental agreement defines the responsibility of each partner, including funding and liabilities, which is a very important part of this intergovernmental agreement. That is the first layer, and that it's a multilateral agreement. The second layer is interesting because this is memorandum of understanding, but that it's only bilateral memorandum of understanding. And it's bilateral agreement between NASA and each of the other partners, meaning that NASA was not only part of the 2, but even more the central part, because the MOUs are bilateral agreement between NASA and ESA, NASA and Russia, NASA and Canada, and NASA Japan. So that gives a central role to NASA, which, in my view, was good. But just to say that among the 5 partners, there were some differences. And the third layer was bilateral implementing arrangements, which are bilateral agreement among 2 of the, or 3, among the 5 partners. ESA, we had implementing agreement with NASA, but also with Russia, with Japan. So I think that that is the third layer. Having spoken of the agreement, after that we had, that is Space Station Freedom as it is, that is the committees. And you have 4 layers of committees. So you have the working level, the box, the 3 box there. This is working level. This is the one who are working. Above that, there is the management level, the multilateral coordination board. And the boss is Monsieur Bill Gerstenmaier. And above, there is a strategic level with the head of agency. But I would not like that you forget the box, the blue, the dark blue one, which is the Intergovernmental Agreement, which is a committee of representative of government. And we should not forget that, because so it was 4 layers of committee, from very political, the dark blue, to the useless part, the head of agency, yes, Sean and me, for example, just enjoying life. And below that, this is the management. This is where they are taking decisions. And the working level, which is where the work is done. So it's complex. It's very complex. But it worked. It worked. And especially each of these committees have tried to develop a culture of consensus. That was interesting. It is written nowhere that we have to develop a consensus. But developing a consensus was the only way to force a dialogue, because the consensus forces you to talk to your neighbors. And so there was really that culture of consensus before any decision is taken. After that, obviously, to make sure that there is a decision, NASA is the one to take the decision, because they are chairing all these committees. So NASA is in charge of the decision. But I wish to insist on the fact that NASA was never taking a decision without trying to find a consensus. And frankly speaking, I don't remember one decision which has been challenged during the history of our cooperative venture, which is good, and which was not obvious. And if it works, and if it still works, in spite of the many problems, I can tell you that it does not work because there was no problem. We had a lot of problems. But if it works, and I would like to insist on that, it's because cooperation has always been the winner of that dialogue. And obviously, cooperation between agencies, cooperation between industry, because we have not to forget that agencies, they do what industry is ready to do. And as I said this morning, industry has much more lobbying power than the agencies, at least in Europe. I can tell you that I have done my best, but I have no chance vis-à-vis Airbus when they go to a government. And the reason is very simple, because the jobs are in industry. Let's say the government, they don't care about the jobs in ESA. That it's, they are not there to pay ESA, the government. They are there to pay industry. And so the lobbying power of industry is much better and much stronger than the power of agencies. But I would like to say that it's not so much the cooperation among agencies or the cooperation among industry which is important. This is a cooperation between men and women. And I have always said cooperation is cooperation between people. And that is certainly the main reason of the success of our cooperation. It's because we had men and women who were committed and willing to work together. And this was the recipe. This is nothing else. And this is the reason why, if I am here and you see my colleagues, it's because we have worked together as individuals. And meaning that in that, and I wish to insist on that, there is a lot of technical expertise behind the space station. But there is even much more human expertise. And when you are working in a cooperative endeavor, the human expertise is maybe more important than the technical expertise. Obviously, you must have the technical expertise. But the human expertise is much more important. And it starts by understanding each other. You have to understand your neighbor. And even if we are speaking, all speaking different English, I must say that, but that it's no problem. I think that we could understand each other even by speaking a totally different English. Apart from the British, I must say that that this is the only ones who are much more difficult to understand. But you have to understand your neighbor, and to understand your neighbor, you have to listen to the neighbor. And that I always quote Monsieur Tony Blair, who has said to President Bush that the best quality of a leader is to listen. And that is something which is very important. You have to listen to your neighbor. And the best solution is to be transparent. And I would like to there on that point to say what means transparency. Transparency does not mean to flow too many information. The more information you are giving, the more opaque you are. So transparency is not the quantity of information, but this is the quality of information, which is important. So you are not transparent because you are flowing a lot of that. Any computer can do that. And this is where the men and women are much more important, because you can find a lot of data in a computer. But to make sure that these data are the ones that you need, only men and women can do that. And the last recipe in this type of dialogue and human expertise is mutual trust. You have to trust your neighbor. If you don't trust your neighbor, you cannot work together. And you cannot buy trust, unfortunately. You have just to build up and to demonstrate that you are trustful, and that this is what we have done together. And this is the key of the success of the International Space Station. So don't look anywhere else. The secret of the success of the space station is the human expertise of all the people who have worked together during 20 years. It was long, but it was very useful. And so, obviously, I have spoken of the technical challenge, the management challenge, which have been solved by the human expertise. So technical challenge by the engineers, the management challenge by the human expertise. And I am coming to the third challenge. But you could measure this partnership and friendship in difficult times. You are not sure of your neighbor until you have a big difficulty to cross. And unfortunately, we had to cross a catastrophe with the loss of Columbia in January, 30th of January 2003, I think, or 1st of February, I don't remember. It was a Saturday in Europe that I can tell you, because I remember very well that day, unfortunately. And so it was a big shock for all the partners. Big shock. And this has been a tragedy for all of us. And that I have said that in Monterey, I shall remember that the Columbia accident was not a tragedy of the US. It was a tragedy for all partners. And this is certainly a tragedy that we shall not forget. We shall not forget. And overcoming the consequence of that does not mean that we are forgetting that it's, yes, we have worked a lot to overcome the consequence of that. But it was not to forget that accident. And I must say that the day after, all forces were on board. Obviously, here in the United States, and I always said that this is thanks to the effort made in the United States to put back the shuttle in flight that we could overcome that problem. But also thanks to the Russians who have given the means to sustain the space station. And also from Europe, Japan, and Canada, we were all mobilized to find the way to overcome that tragedy. To put back the shuttle in flight conditions, to keep the parts in orbit running, and also to keep the parts on ground. And I can tell you that we were on that side, because almost all our parts were still on ground. To keep the parts on ground still alive, in spite of that break. But okay, we have all worked together, and the result was, I would say, just a break of 2 years in the assembly phase. The consequence of that was also a clear focus on the assembly rather than on utilization, that we had no choice after the Columbia accident than to say, let's first make the assembly and then we shall look at utilization. And certainly a reinforcement of the partnership. I think that the partnership after the tragedy was even stronger than before the tragedy. And at the end, we have this International Space Station, which was fully completed in 2011, almost at the year when it was supposed to end, according to the original plan of 93. But with all modules and elements running, 6 astronauts permanently on board. To have these 6 astronauts living and working safely on board, we have 6,000 persons working on ground together in 4 different control centers on 3 continents. And without the strong cooperation and even the friendship between the 6,000 persons, the 6 guys there would be in difficulty. And that is certainly the one of the essence of what we are doing. So now the operations are planned to continue at least until 2024. But we know that it's still possible until 2028. We shall see. Meaning that the original 12 years of exploitation, which was in the joint plan, are still ahead of us, which is good. I repeat, this is the men and the women of the International Space Station which have made the history and which are still making the history every day. Because before being a laboratory for scientific progress, the space station is a laboratory for human progress. And I have said that many times. We should not export the problems of planet Earth to space, and on the contrary, we have to import the cooperation in space to planet Earth. And that is certainly one of the most important lessons learned from this International Space Station. To say that at the beginning of the year there was a warning for a leakage And I remember all the crew went to the Russian module, and I have said to the journalist, because it was at the time where the relationship with Russia was not fully green, but I have said, you see, that Russia could be even a very good country because our 6 astronauts are there. So yes, we have to import the spirit of cooperation from space to planet Earth. So before going to the next, which is the exploitation phase, I wish to pay a tribute to the space shuttle. Not only because I have worked on the space shuttle, but because that space station would not exist without the space shuttle. And the space shuttle is still, and by far, the most beautiful horse that I know. I must say that I had the privilege to work for the Space Shuttle main engine, but I had also the privilege, thanks to Charlie Precourt, by the way, to go the night before a launch with a crew to be at the Space Shuttle when it was already breathing and so on. It's a fantastic experience, and that I shall never forget that. So the Space Shuttle is a fantastic transportation system. The last flight was on the 11th of July, 2011, after 135 flights in 30 years, 37 flights to ISS, and transporting 1,600 metric tons to orbit, which is a lot, and more than 800 astronauts into orbit. That it's so this is the most beautiful horse. I repeat that, and obviously paying a tribute to the space shuttle is also paying a tribute to the astronauts who have given their lives to the progress of humanity. So let's move now to the exploitation phase. So we have several problems to solve every day. Number one, exploiting a condominium of 5 apartments. And that needs a set of rules to exploit such a condominium. Number two, we have to make the operations and the maintenance of that building, meaning that, and the only objective is to lower the cost, because I can tell you that that is certainly a daily objective for all the ones who are working on the space station, is how can we lower the cost of operations and maintenance. The third is utilization, and that the objective is maximizing the benefit of the investment. We have also to prepare the exploration beyond low Earth orbit, and we are doing more and more of that. And I shall finish by the importance of astronauts. So first, exploiting a condominium of 5 apartments requires a set of rules, which are how to share the resources and how to share the cost. This is, as in any condominium, you have rules to share the elevator and to share the cost. This is the set of rules. Because of the history of ISS, and you have to appreciate that, among the 5 apartments, there is one very special apartment, which is the Russian one. Because the Russian one, they don't share. They use 100% of the Russian part, and they pay for 100% of the cost of the Russian part. So that is just to say that it's not so much a condominium of 5 apartments. There is 1 apartment and 4 apartments. So, okay, that the Russians, they are making a clear separation between them and the 4 others. But the 4 others, it's a real condominium, and we have a share of resources and a share of cost. Just to say that United States, obviously, they are the biggest, and because they are paying the most, they have 76.6% of rights and duties, because there is the right of utilization and the duty of paying their share of the cost. After that is Japan, who has 12.8%. After that, it's Europe with 8.3%, and Canada with 2.3%. So this is a share of the common parts between the partners of freedom, meaning that we have the right of utilization of these resources, but we have the duty to pay our share of the cost, that it's an obligation. And this is where I am coming to the next point, which is operations and maintenance. First objective is to lower the cost. That is a daily work, with a special attention to the transportation cost, because transportation costs are a significant part of the operations and maintenance, because you have to bring there a lot of tons. I have not made the computation, but it's several tens of tons per year that we have to bring up there just to make the 6 astronauts living and breathing, to make the space station keeping its orbit, to change the experiments, the hardware, and so on. So it's several tens of tons of payload to be brought to the space station, and it costs a lot. So there is a heavy traffic around the space station. I think that it's almost 1 launch per month, average, I assume. So there is always somebody going to the space station. And to lower the cost, I think that NASA has made an interesting step by looking at commercial transport. And that we have seen, that is not that one, that is Columbus, that it's progress, that it's not yet commercial, even if we pay for that. But the first one is Dragon, and the second one is Cygnus. And these 2 commercial transportation are part of the efforts made by NASA to lower the cost. And just to say that Cygnus, which is provided by Orbital ATK, the pressurized part is built in Europe as the heritage of the famous Space Lab and the pressurized module of the space station. So that it's for the transportation. The key was to use commercial providers. But we are also taking care of the operations, because we have 4 control centers in the world. 1 in Houston, 1 in Oberpfaffenhofen in Germany, 1 in Moscow, and 1 in Tsukuba in Japan. And we are trying to reduce the cost of the operations, mostly by taking the lessons learned. I have tried, when I was Director General, to reduce the number of control centers, but I must say that I did not succeed. It was a total failure, because I was proposing to suppress Houston to the benefit of Oberpfaffenhofen, but I did not succeed. So we have to keep the 4 control centers, but what we are trying to do collectively is to use the lessons learned and the return of experience to reduce the cost. And at least in Oberpfaffenhofen, we succeeded to reduce the cost by 30%, which is not bad. And we reduce the cost, but we have to pay them. We have one basic principle, which is trying to minimize the exchange of funds. We have always avoided to transfer euros to NASA, because they would not know what to do with these euros. So we are working with basically no exchange of funds, meaning that we are creating barter. Barter means that instead of paying, you bring something in kind. And at start, we at ESA, we were paying our common operation cost by in kilograms to the International Space Station with the ATV. And this is the reason why we have launched 5 ATV to the space station to bring kilos in orbit. We have launched 5 of them, almost 30 tons of metric tons of payload brought to the space station. And we brought fuel, fluids, hardware, all what is needed to onboard the space station. But with the arrival of commercial cargo resupply, ATV was not anymore the workhorse of the resupply, which used to be. I remember discussions where Bill was asking me to launch ATV with the right pace because ATV was the workhorse for some time. But with the arrival of the commercial cargo resupply, we were not unique anymore. And this is the reason why instead of paying in kilograms, now we are paying in hardware. European hardware that we are providing to NASA. And this is the service module of Orion that has been decided to pay our share of common operation cost. I must say that the easy part was the meeting with Bill Gerstenmaier. And after that, the difficult part was starting. But with Bill, we have agreed that it could be useful for NASA and ESA that the service module would be built in Europe. After that, we had some argument, especially with industry. But at the end, and I have good news, since Bill was telling me today that the service module is on track for the first launch of Orion. And that is, again, the way ESA is paying its share of common operation cost, not by paying NASA, but by providing hardware to NASA. And I must say that this service module is a fantastic breakthrough in our common history, and I would like to underline that. Because this is the first time ever that ESA is developing a part of a crew transportation system. We have never been. We had design of Hermes, but there was no hardware. This is the first time that we are providing some hardware for a crew transportation system. And on the other side, this is the first time that NASA dares to put somebody else on the critical path of a crew transportation system. So it's a breakthrough for both ESA and NASA. And I think it's a sign of mutual trust. And as I said, the mutual trust, you cannot buy it. You have to build up that trust and to demonstrate. And I think that we have demonstrated that we could trust each other. And that is the result is the service module of Orion. Next, it's utilization. That we have only one objective, which is to maximize the return. The space station is a unique laboratory where you find an environment that you cannot find anywhere else. You find microgravity, you find altitude to observe. And it's very interesting because you are only at 400 kilometers, and there is no Earth observation satellite sustainable at 400 kilometers. You have vacuum, so you have a lot of characteristics that you cannot find anywhere else. So this is a laboratory. There is a queue of scientists using this International Space Station. Scientists not only from the partners. I wish to say that there is more and more scientists coming from non-partners of the space station, and that it's good, meaning that the space station becomes an international, a more international laboratory than it was planned to do. So that is a lot of experiments that you see that should be Luca Parmitano making an experiment inside the space station. You have also a lot of experiments outside the space station. And certainly the most important one is the IMS payload, which is a fantastic research laboratory per se, which has been launched and docked and attached to the space station in the last but one flight of the space shuttle, if I remember well. And but we are making also Earth observation. We are making astronomy from outside the space station. And the last part of utilization is the commercial utilization, which is an important part also. How can we use that laboratory for commercial users, including, by the way, space tourists. I think that there were already 8 space tourists on board the space station, something like that. And I hope I shall be the next one, but that it's another story. I am just discussing with my previous colleagues. But if you have part of the $40 million that I need to fly, you are welcome. But okay, I have just to say that I have restarted the competition among the space power, just for me, because I have spoken of cooperation during all my speech, but I have organized a competition because before, when I was going to leave ESA, when I met Monsieur Komarov, the boss of the Russian Space Agency, he was asking me, what do you plan to do? I said, very simple. I shall make $40 million in the next 3 years, and I shall buy 1 week on board the space station. And Komarov was answering, but for you, I shall make a discount. So I said, okay, I keep that. Be careful, I may come back. So that was with Komarov, and 1 month later, I met Charlie Bolden, and he was asking me the usual question, what will you do? So I said, okay, $40 million to buy 1 week. But Komarov is making a discount. And that Charlie was saying, oh, yes, but I shall make you a price that Komarov cannot make. And to show that I am serious, I shall fly with you. I think that you are a witness of that. So that was with Charlie Bolden. And it was 3 weeks later, I was in Beijing, and same question from my colleague of China. And I said 40 million, 1 week. But Komarov is making a discount. Bolden is making a better price. And that the Chinese said, but we shall make a price that nobody can beat. And that, okay. Here we are. I shall tell you more next time. But so just to say that you can be tourist on board the space station, and that it's part of the commercial utilization of the space station. But there is more, obviously, commercial utilization than just space tourist. And maybe one word on that, be it for science or commercial use, one of the most intriguing problems is the intellectual property. How do we manage the intellectual property? Because when you have an experiment proposed by a European scientist made in a Japanese module by a US astronaut, how do you manage the intellectual property? So I know that there are rules, the lawyers are working on that, but this is an interesting piece of discussion. And I am sure that even though there are rules, the day there will be real discoveries and real consequence, I am sure that discussions on intellectual property will come back. That I can bet on that. So that it's the utilization. Preparation of exploration, I think that we are all now, all the partners are using the space station to prepare the exploration beyond low Earth orbit, and that includes a lot of different experiments, test and qualification of new technologies, and for example, all technologies related to recycling the resources, because when we shall be on the moon or on Mars, we shall have to recycle the resources. The human behavior for long duration flight, and as you have seen, and I think that I have a picture of them. This is the 2 guys who are spending 1 year on board the space station, and just to prepare the long duration flight for exploration beyond low Earth orbit. We are developing standard interface. Because as I said, this is something that we have failed on board the space station, but I think that for the exploration beyond low Earth orbit, we need standard interface. So all that is to prepare the exploration beyond low Earth orbit. I would like to conclude with the importance of astronauts, not because we have Bill ready with us tonight, because I am saying that anytime. The astronauts are a unique part of the ISS program. And you cannot, if the ISS was not manned, I think that there would be much less interest. And so the astronauts are a unique part of the ISS program. Not only obviously to make experiments, not obviously just to make maintenance and repair, Yes, they are better than robots, but that we know that no need to go to space to demonstrate that. But the astronauts are much more important than that. First of all, because they are the part of the human progress. The fact that we have 6 persons on board who are making a laboratory of cooperation on board. They have to work together. They can not like all of them, but they have no choice but to work together because the safety and efficiency is linked to that. So it's a laboratory of cooperation and human progress. That is number one. Number two, they are witnesses. They are witnesses for all humanity. The value of witness is very important. You have a lot of things that you know in books, but to have someone who has seen something is much more important. And that, I have said that recently in Stockholm for the meeting of space explorers, the fact that the 3 guys of Apollo 8 have seen the Earth like a small ball of golf. Everybody knew that the Earth was like that. But to have 3 witnesses able to come back and to say, yes, we have seen planet Earth like that, was very important. They are also the best ambassadors of space on planet Earth. And for the public, for the young generation. I think that I have said many times when I was Director General, when I was on the podium with an astronaut, nobody cared about the Director General. I must say that I was totally transparent and absent. All the public and young generation, they were looking at the astronaut. And I know why. Because I have wondered why they are only looking at the astronaut. So I am as beautiful as an astronaut. So, but I have understood why. It's because the public and the young generation, they are not taking a Director General as a man. An astronaut looks like a man. A Director General is at best a bureaucrat, at worst, I don't know, a politician. While an astronaut looks like a man or a woman, and the proof is that the public is always asking to the astronaut, how do you sleep? Do you dream? What do you eat? I have never been asked this type of question. Never. Never. So this is the reason why the connection between the public and the astronaut is much more important than the connection between the public and the Director General. And they have the capability to attract the young generation to science and technology. I think that this is why the astronauts are so important. And as I said many times when I was director, the astronauts are even much more important on ground than in space, so that they can be useful in space, but they are much more important on ground. So, in short, the ISS is today the result of a very long story. Very, very long, involving a lot of steps, involving several generations of people. Let's say the ones who were there at the start, they are not there anymore. But all these generations could transmit the commitment of the previous one. And this is men and women who have brought each of them a stone to pave the way to the future. I think that each men and women of the space station, they've brought one stone to pave the way to the future. So this was long, too long, but it's over. This is the past. So the most interesting part is still the future. It's still to come. And this will be your part to you, the students, not anymore my part. I think that I am still ready to work, but it will be mostly your part. And the problems, just to say, the problems that you students, you will have to solve are even much more complex than the ones that we have solved. We have made the easy part. Because the world will become more and more complex, that I am sure of that. The problems will become more and more complex because the more you are pushing the frontier of knowledge, the more you have to go to complexity to find solutions. So unfortunately, the bad news for you is that we have made the easy part. You will have to make the difficult part. But what I am sure is that whatever complex problems that you will have to solve, I wish to repeat that a key is cooperation. You have to cooperate. You have to cooperate with all people of the world, and this is the only recipe that I can give you. You have to invent the future. And you have to invent the future that you want, not the future that we want, the future that you want, not the future that you just manage. Managing is boring. Not, and even worse, the future that you would accept. So don't accept the future. You have to make the future that you want. So this is your task now, your responsibility, and just keep in mind the importance of cooperation. And cooperation is a learning process. You are not cooperating just because you are gifted for cooperation. You learn how to cooperate. And that is very important. So please learn how to cooperate, because this is the recipe for the future. So thank you very much.
Well, at this point, we have an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with a panel of folks who have lived the experience that Jean-Jacques Dordain just illuminated here on all the various challenges. So I'm going to ask the four of them to come on up and have a seat at the table here so that you have an opportunity to hear from them, and then we can go to a discussion and questions and answers from the group and collective as well. So we want to put to the immediate left of Jean-Jacques Dordain is Bill Gerstenmaier. He is currently the incumbent associate administrator for space operations and mission-related activities in the operational side of what NASA is engaged in. So it is his problem day in and day out to make sure the International Space Station continues to operate, and the full range of all the other programs that are conducted by NASA on a day-in and day-out basis all arrive at his doorstep or depart from his doorstep, either way. Next to him is Bill Reedy, who is previously his predecessor in the same capacity, but he is one of those legendary human figures that Jean-Jacques referred to as people who were asked, what do you eat, how do you sleep? Yes, he was an astronaut. He actually spent several missions as a commander and as a pilot of different shuttle missions during the course of his career. And after having completed all the fun parts of the job, that's when he came to the capacity as an administrator. He started off as a naval aviator and has never forgotten that part of the equation, and has carried that throughout his experience as well. Certainly has a lot of experience on many of the capabilities that Jean-Jacques Dordain described as earlier predecessors of the station. And at the end, next to Bill Reedy, is Mike Hawes, who was at the very beginning, at the time that Jean-Jacques Dordain referred to as the Space Station Freedom Enterprise. He began his NASA career about that time, working through that set of challenges, having spent the better part of almost 35 years, I guess, in federal service at NASA, 33 in federal service at NASA. He is now at Lockheed Martin Corporation as a vice president there, and responsible for many of the kinds of familiar programs that he saw in the course of his 3 decades of experience at NASA. So his span of course, the entirety of the station program of this 30 years of challenging fits and starts that Jean-Jacques described for us is part of the legacy that Mike brings to the table as well. So I would ask the 3 additional folks, starting with Bill Gerstenmaier, just to comment briefly on a couple of points that they may have found that Jean-Jacques raised in terms of either memories or his observations they'd like to elaborate on. and then go to Bill Reedy and Mike Hawes, and then we'll open it up to a broader Q&A from each of you. Bill, thank you very much for being here. We're really thrilled you're here.
I sure would say that what Jean-Jacques talked about, the human aspect of the technical challenge of the space station is really critical to the success that we have. I think it also, the other point that he brought out is when you face a challenge as a team, how you either come together to solve that challenge or does that challenge drive you apart. And when we had the Columbia tragedy, I remember that Saturday morning, I called all the program managers from the space station, each one of them, and told them what had happened. I explained to them what we were going to try to go do moving forward and how I needed their help. The Russians were about ready to go launch a Progress vehicle. I asked them to hold off on the launch until we made sure we understood what cargo needed to go. There was no question about whether they would hold off on the launch. They were ready to stand down and move forward. It was also really hard for the partnership because none of their modules were on orbit yet. So here they were getting tremendous pressure from their governments, and all the utilization phase was supposed to be occurring, and they're sitting, waiting around. And then you know, my job in the station program was essentially to keep the hardware in orbit, as Jean-Jacques described, while the shuttle program under Bill Reedy and Sean figured out how to get the shuttle back to flight. And I didn't know when the shuttle was going to come back to flight. I didn't know how we were going to continue to operate as a partnership. I didn't know what we were going to go do. This 15 years of continuous crew presence, there was no assurity. Without this shuttle that was supposed to come and deliver supplies and cargo, there was no operating plan for station. So we had to reinvent all of that in an extremely short period of time and figure out a method of dropping the crew size from 3 down to 2, relying on the Russians, shrinking back on resources. But again, it took the entire partnership to work together. That didn't come about easy, but again, it's this whole team seeing a bigger vision and kind of rising above their own maybe political, government, individual interests and figuring out a way as a team to go pull all this stuff off. So I think that's what I would add out of Jean-Jacques' talk. You may not appreciate in this audience what a wonderful presentation you just had from Jean-Jacques, but there was probably no more a concise, thorough, accurate description of the history of station than what you got to hear from Jean-Jacques. It was absolutely amazing for me to hear that again and hear it from Jean-Jacques' perspective. And it's also fun to be on these panels in a sense because, you know, this is like the team that's touching the elephant, right? We all know our own individual pieces, but sometimes we don't hear the other side until someone describes it. But I would feel the angst from the European Space Agency when their hardware wasn't flying or their modules weren't going or they weren't getting their utilization time. That was real and palatable, but then to hear Jean-Jacques describe it from his words, he put up with a lot. He was a lot nicer to me than he probably should have been when we were interacting through those periods. So I think those are my thoughts. Bill?
Well, I agree with what Bill said. It's been a marvelous presentation, and they do have very different perspectives to add. But I'm trying to put myself in your shoes right now, being in school, and what was going on when I was in school, when I was your age. And a lot of the things that Jean-Jacques described were going on contemporarily. The last footprints on the moon in 1972. The Skylab. Matter of fact, I'll out Mike right now. He didn't start NASA with Freedom. He started NASA with Skylab.
So I'm older.
And arguably wiser, I'll give you that. So those were the things that were going on. Apollo-Soyuz. You know, and as Jean-Jacques said, again, in the midst of the Cold War, as hot as the Cold War was getting, we did Apollo-Soyuz. And that was about the time that I was getting into naval aviation. And I never in a million years thought that at some point I would be doing something similar to that in the Shuttle Mir program and being involved in what was to be the first phase of the International Space Station. I was really very, very lucky to be involved in kind of the transition of Space Shuttle. So I flew on the first International Microgravity Laboratory, which was the European Space Lab in the shuttle, managed by Jean-Jacques Dordain over at ESA. The next flight, we had German participation with an ultraviolet telescope that we flew and deployed with the Canadian robot arm and got back later on. We also had a U.S. communications satellite. You know, content from our international partners. And then the final flight that I flew was a docking mission with the Mir space station. And I think you saw the picture there. The shuttle itself was about 100 tons. The Mir space station was about 120 tons. So, I mean, they're almost equivalent in size. As they said, the International Space Station in the configuration that's flying now is as big as a football field. It's kind of like if you take two jumbo jets and put them nose to nose, the wingspan of the solar arrays are about that large, and all the habitable volume inside those two jumbo jets would be something like the International Space Station. And oh, by the way, not only was it assembled on orbit by people wearing gloves and using robotic arms, most of those pieces, you know, that were built in Japan and Europe and Russia had not met their mate necessarily on this planet. And oh, by the way, all the plumbing had to work and the software had to work and those 40 different configurations had to fly successfully. And so I would argue that this is probably one of the most magnificent engineering feats of the 20th and maybe the beginning of the 21st century, that it all came off, and it came off so flawlessly. But I'd also offer that it's not about the hardware. I think the quote was Mike Griffin earlier that, you know, the partnership will last much longer than the hardware. And the hardware right now is supposed to go through 2024 or 2028, or who knows how long the hardware will last. But think back to Apollo-Soyuz in 1975. When it came time to do the international cooperation with the Russians in 1992, we were able to use that same bridge, those same relationships from 1975 to build the program into International Space Station. So to make the transition through the redesign from Freedom into what became International Space Station, including the Russians as an international partner. So I believe, and still today, absolutely. And so I believe, and I'm going to ask Jean-Jacques this in a moment, but I believe that this is the foundation for exploration. And the foundation is not simply a hardware foundation, it's a foundation of relationships among peoples. You know, you talk about the different control centers, but you also had people literally in almost every time zone around the world, all cooperating, all doing 24/7 operations through some very thin times and arguably we think right now maybe the salad days, some really interesting and exciting times for doing scientific exploration and paving the way, I think, for exploration to come. So with that, I'll yield the balance of the time to my colleague, Mike Haas.
So Jean-Jacques and I have known each other for 30-ish years, probably. When he was doing the utilization side of Space Station Freedom for ESA, I was doing the operations side of Space Station Freedom for NASA. But we were one group on the NASA side that dealt with all these issues. And there were some fascinating things that came of that. He used a few words in his discussions. He talked about things that were bilateral arrangements and things that were multilateral arrangements. The design teams tended to work bilaterally. They could design an interface between a Columbus lab and a node. The operations and utilization teams chose from the very beginning to operate multilaterally because it was going to be one crew, it was one operation, it had to be done as one team working together. So there were, even within the program structures, we were this weird outlier of they're already working all together with all of the challenges that exist. Why do we care? Why is this cooperation so important? And Bill was kind of leading you all to that path, is everything we're going to do from now has to be done internationally. And I think that's what certainly all of us at this table are convinced, that all of these exploration and these aspirational missions that we have, and yes, I haven't seen the Martian movie yet, but I did read the book, those are going to be international missions. And we have built the precursor steps that Jean-Jacques went through. Absolutely agree. And the Freedom Years were fundamental in building a partnership amongst 4 agencies that the Russians could not have worked with if we had not done that, in my opinion. And so we have continued that cooperation, and that is what is going to make exploration successful as we go much further from Earth and much more challenging missions. Now, they also joked about the deal for exploration that the two of them crafted, and we were commenting earlier, they crafted it and then they handed it off to myself and my NASA counterpart to actually implement. So as the prime building the Orion spacecraft, I'm still accountable for integrating US-built components and European-built components and certifying to Bill that that spacecraft is ready to fly. So thank you, gentlemen. And so I'll yield back to our moderator.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it, Mike. And thank, again, to all four of you. Thank you for making the time to come to upstate New York and Syracuse University to be part of this discussion. This really is, I think, as Bill Gerstenmaier mentioned, a remarkable event to listen to this from so many different perspectives of people who have lived the largest, most elaborate, challenging systems integration management issue that I've ever heard of as a program management objective. So it is the quintessential example of strategic management and leadership, the very focus of this. Let me pose just a question, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone here that I hope will generate a little bit of thought of, to use your imaginations, the four of you, on what you could envision as the application of scientific findings aboard this particular laboratory in space that have applications for those of us here on Earth, like the rest of the 99.999%, percent of all the people who will never have an opportunity to be on this particular laboratory experience will nonetheless benefit by the activities there. And I think part of the precursor to that question also is Jean-Jacques' description of the uniqueness of this laboratory. It's can't be replicated here on Earth by virtue of its capacity to operate in a microgravity condition constantly without having to artificially manufacture that condition, which we can't do for any extended period of time. It is there as a natural phenomenon, plus all the other features he added to it that are, from a scientific standpoint, from a technical standpoint, very, very operative. So having dieseled around for a few minutes to give you guys some thought, to use your imagination as widely as you could, let me start with Bill Gerstenmaier and then proceed that way, because we're going to come back to Jean-Jacques Dordain to conclude on that point to figure out what it is we could possibly do here. Bill, you deal with this every day. This question.
I think what I see is the big advantage the space station does here terrestrially is, I call it an innovation accelerator. In other words, it lets you see physical phenomena without one gravity. So any phenomena that has a gravity term in the equation is altered by going to space. So you get a different way of looking at physical processes, biological processes without gravity. And that is the spark of innovation, that you can then learn something new about a phenomena. So we know, for example, crews on orbit, for some reason, the immune system degrades on orbit while they're on orbit. Their immune system is not nearly as strong as it is terrestrial. That's the same phenomenon that occurs in the elderly. So now you have this model that you can now look at on space station, and how can you get new remedies for the system degradation to fight infection, or the degradation in the immune system. Another thing that occurs is bone loss. Significant bone loss occurs on station, about 1% per year. And again, you get a chance to look at that. Another one is muscle wasting. A third one is the vestibular response, how you keep your balance, how you stay orientation. All those phenomena occur terrestrially to the elderly population. You get a chance to look at all those phenomena on station. And if we let our researchers take advantage of station, I think they'll come up with some pretty creative solutions to things moving forward. And it's really funny when you look at a phenomena that you see on the ground, and now you see it in zero gravity, you can do very simple physics equations, and you can actually see, parts bounce off with the right momentum. And if you're an engineer, you know what that means. You can look at thin films and see them grow thick. You can look at materials processing. Anything without convection changes radically in space. So you give a tremendous platform to the research community. And then the big advantage of station is its long duration. It can be a research facility just like on the ground. You don't have to have just a proof of a theory is what we've done previously in space experiments. They were to prove a certain theory. This way you can now actually do more of the creative kind of investigation that needs the humans. And you could find phenomena that don't occur on the ground. There's a phenomena that we saw on Mir called cool flames. When a candle on the Earth would essentially burn out, it no longer burns out in space. So there's no convection to drive the combustion. The combustion is just driven by the physical transport of the fuel and the oxidizer chemically reacting in the candle, and it doesn't have any temperature. It's just a cool flame. What that is that's reminiscent of what occurs when ignition begins in an engine. When the first couple milliseconds of an engine, it's driven not by the convection, but it's driven just by the chemical properties of the oxidizer and the fuel reacting. So now you get to see that in space for now multiple seconds or even minutes as this candle extinguishes in space. That's going to give the combustion researchers a whole new way to look at combustion. But we learned that by a crew member who just said, hey, wait a minute, I know I was only supposed to take pictures during the candle burn, but hey, after this candle got done, look at all this weird stuff I'm seeing. And so that was the innovative side that you get with Station. When you're not having to do research on a timeline, you can now experiment and play with it. So I think those are some of the things that I think we'll see with Station in the future. And there's plenty more, but those are some of the big ones, I think. But I think the big advantage is really creative and inventive ways to help with the elderly and problems we see.
Well, without question, the fundamental research that's going on up there, both into the humans, and the physical phenomena, material science, and others, is unique, truly unique. But the other thing is, think about the problems that you must solve in order to deal with the realities of spaceflight. And certainly when you go beyond low Earth orbit and you go to the moon or Mars or wherever, those problems that you're going to have to solve, those have direct application to our life here on Earth. I mean, closing the life supports loops so that you're not taking water up there all the time, so that you're actually able to reuse the water. That has come a very, very long way. You think about urine, perspiration, all the other waste water that comes off into the atmosphere, and you're able to scavenge that back out. If you've seen The Martian, that kind of plays a part in it. The other things, right now, I think what's stretching people's imagination is the fact that we're able to do either, depending on your view of it, either additive manufacturing or 3D printing. Okay, those are two things that are evolving right now to the point where you can actually do it using metals. Well, they're doing it aboard the International Space Station. If you think about what you're going to need to do when you get to the moon or Mars or en route, you're not going to be able to take all the spare parts that you'd like, but you can certainly take all the ones and zeros to make them, and you can take the raw materials that it takes to be able to make replacement parts and things like that. So dealing with some of those operational realities and how those work back here on Earth too, I think is really very, very important.
So the exploration aspect is a great one that I live every day from the standpoint of building a ship that's going to take humans out further and further, and it's all the things Bill mentioned, but it's the higher reliability systems. It's really minimizing that logistics strain and also making the system simpler. We're 3D printing lots of parts for Orion today, but being able to demonstrate with lunar regolith or Martian soil, those same kind of processes and phenomena, that's where you have to get. You have to be able to live off the land. Now, I would give Bill's team a shout out from a research perspective. They join with the American Astronautical Society each year and have an ISS research conference. And there's a lot that comes out of it. I think it's in its 5th year or so that, and we have presentations from researchers across the partnership, and really some tantalizing things that have already come out. Osteoporosis treatments that are now over $1 billion a year pharmaceuticals that were developed initially through space research. Drugs that have the potential to arrest muscular dystrophy. So there's really some fascinating things coming out. But like many research stages, they're in the very early stage, and they would have to go through a long process to actually get to any of us as the consumers or users of those products.
Okay, I think that. Since I have spoken too much, I should be short. I think that all what has been said by my predecessor, but just to underline what was just said, you have to realize that the utilization of the space station is very recent, and a lot of discoveries take much more time to find the real discoveries. But we have already had a Nobel Prize given to scientists who have used the space station. And there was an Israeli person who was got a Nobel Prize from the experiments made on board the space station. So we are just at the very beginning, because we are at much less than 10 years of utilization of this unique environment. So the most beautiful part is still coming. And using the microgravity, it's a totally new world. And it will take time to take all the benefit of this new world. But since I have made the first combustion experiments in microgravity with Monsieur Jeff Hoffman on board the KC-135, and there is a lot behind all what we are learning on combustion, because it's not only for rocket engines, it's for all car engines. We shall much improve the efficiency of car engines by understanding the combustion process of droplets. So there is a lot of potential, but that will come. The key that the space station has brought a continuous access to this new world of microgravity, and that this is very recent. It's, again, much less than 10 years. So I am sure that there is a lot to come from the use of the space station. And this is the reason why, yes, exploration will be exploration of the moon, of Mars, of asteroids, and so on. But the use of low Earth orbit is by far not finished. I think that there is a future in the exploitation of low Earth orbit because of all the experiments that we were talking.
Let's open it up. Questions, comments? Oh yeah, okay. Ken?
So the space station is now, one of the years in the making, and we see every day technology has changed dramatically in everything we have here, and I would assume that in some of the components of the space station, technology probably has come a long way. Is the space station being updated? Is the hardware being updated? I mean, how are you managing that whole process?
That's yours, Bill.
Yeah, we're continuing to update. We used to have roughly about 100 megabits per second down. We now have almost 300, 400 megabits per second. We'll probably go up to almost a gigabit per second of downlink. We used to only have 4 channels of TV. We now have 6. So we're upgrading systems on board station all the time. We're putting an international docking adapter on the outside of Space Station. Jean-Jacques talked about that. That'll be used by the commercial companies that come up and dock to station. That international docking adapter will be the docking adapter used for all future exploration vehicles. So we're continuing to upgrade station almost continuously as we move forward. The big thing has also been this 3D printing on board station. We can now start to print components for repairs, and we don't have to take everything off the Earth and fly it up. We're going to actually look at we pack a lot of our material that comes up in plastic. We're going to look at essentially grinding that plastic up and then using the 3D printer to actually make parts for components of station out of the waste products. So we're doing a lot of upgrades. We'll also do a lot of technology development. We have the water system is 86% closed loop on board station, so sweat gets reprocessed, urine gets reprocessed. Even the waste carbon dioxide, it gets combined with hydrogen that comes off of the oxygen generator, and we make water out of that, and then methane is a waste gas. We're going to continue to drive that recycling even further along and probably try to close the loop even more on the water side. So lots of upgrades are coming.
And in fact, Bill has to upgrade the waste management system for Space Station, so we're actually doing that so that we can use the same system on Orion. So we're tying the two programs together in ways where we can use a space station upgrade, or they can look at our technologies and see if it makes sense to flow it back into Space Station.
And the CO2 removal removal system that Mike has on Orion, that CO2 removal system is on station today being operated in a contingency case when we need it on station. So we're using this thing in a pretty innovative way. And we're also trying to reduce the amount of time it takes to get cargo to space. So we hear that a lot from folks. So we're really working hard where we can fly stuff in a matter of months. So someone can go from the design product to actually having a product on orbit to actually experiment with in several months. And we're working on that as well.
Other comments? Yes, please, Mike.
What do you think, this is for anyone, what do you think it is about space that engenders the cooperation? What is it about space that engenders cooperation? It seems much more easily in space than down here on Earth.
No, but that is what I have tried to say. I think that cooperation in space has always been the precursor of cooperation on ground. And as I said, it's a fantastic laboratory for cooperation because you can cooperate with people that. Okay, maybe I shall come back to what I always saying. You cooperate on a given project because you have common interest on that project. Does not mean that you have common interest on everything, but you can decide that on a particular project in space, you have common interest. And common interest is the best way to cooperate. And I know that my wife hates that I am saying that you cooperate because you don't cooperate because you love each other. You cooperate because you have mutual interest. And you can define on a given project that you have mutual interest. It's exactly Apollo-Soyuz. When USA and USSR, they have made Apollo-Soyuz, did not mean that they had common interest on all aspects of their activities and policy, but they made it. And that was a precursor of more cooperation on ground.
I think there's also another complementary element to that, and that is we all wound up spending quite a bit of time over in Russia, gearing up for the Phase 1 program that was Shuttle Mir and then International Space Station. And what I think Jean-Jacques has zeroed in on is it's about the mission. It becomes a whole lot easier to cooperate and to focus when there is a mission, and whether the mission is return to flight, whether it's something more narrow like that was, or build an International Space Station. It becomes a whole lot easier to cooperate. And the other thing is, having spent that time overseas and learning the language and training in their system and everything, the cooperation comes from being able to communicate. And the illusion, of course, is communication actually happens. I mean, communication, it's not transmitting. It's transmitting, receiving, tuning, getting to where communication actually occurs. And I think what we found was that communication is based on two things. And Jean-Jacques nailed one of them, which is trust. But that trust comes from mutual respect. And the more you learn about your partners, the more you respect their capabilities. And I have to say, when we first got over there after an interval of 20-some years, a lot of those same players weren't there in Russia. And so maybe kind of the respect for our capabilities, was at kind of a low ebb, I think, for a while, until they actually spent time with us and realized what the space shuttle was capable of. No, it couldn't fly for 60 days or 180 days, but you know what? It could do an awful lot of other things that they couldn't even dream of doing. And vice versa, is the fact that they didn't ever succeed in building their space shuttle and operating it didn't mean that the Mir space station was any less capable, or the fact that they chose to do long duration space flight rather than what we chose to do in terms of sortie type operations. They were different, but it turns out extremely complementary. And we realized that we had a tremendous amount to learn from each other. As soon as you kind of dial back that pride and chauvinism that naturally exists.
So I would twist just one other piece of that and combine a little bit of Bill and Jean-Jacques. So the that mission focus that Bill raises, to me, also gets to Jean-Jacques' emotional component. And I think the aspect about space that really drives people together is because it allows you to connect on that emotional component. And that's really comes from the trust, it comes from the mission. You can share that mission. It's not just all of the technical problems that you're resolving.
Another dimension is also the challenge dimension. You know, I believe the tasks that we're being asked to solve are so difficult that I think we all recognize that each one of us individually or even as a country can't necessarily solve that problem alone. You know, we have to figure out a way, if we really want to try to achieve that challenge of moving human presence into the solar system, we're going to have to do that as a interconnected international community. There's no way we can, I don't believe any country will have the resources to take that challenge on alone. So then how do we figure out a way to team together and, as Bill said, pull the best of all the pieces together, put them into assemblage and move forward. And that requires you to look at things a different way. So you have to be willing to give something up, as Bill described, but then you're going to get something back. But then ultimately you both win because now you've accomplished a goal that neither one of you could do alone.
Another question? Yes, Harry.
How are you? Thank you
Oh,
for...
sorry, there's one question back here, excuse me.
What?
He's got the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for visiting us here at Maxwell. I'm an MPA, an environmental science graduate student from here. My question is about the space debris that is known to be all around orbiting the Earth. Like, there is a lot of it. And I know now that countries, you know, in Europe, the United States, mostly in Europe, are cutting budgets because everyone is broke and there is no growth and blah, blah. So you got to cut cost. And how are you trying to, like, are you guys thinking on collecting all that debris and kind of like recycling it to make more parts or something like that? Or what is being done to try to reuse all that stuff that is orbiting the Earth? Or if anything?
So the first aspect I would speak to is knowing where it is. You know, the most important thing for us today as we fly through those regions is to know where it is, to know how dense the material it is, what directions and velocities it has. Because today what we do is we shield our spacecraft from that debris. And we know that there are some things we move away from, some things we shield, and some things we know we couldn't stop, and we have to have contingencies to deal with that. There are a lot of concepts that have been proposed for ways to mitigate or to either bring the debris to a low orbit where it degrades into the atmosphere. The challenges with any kinetic ideas of dispersing the debris just creates more. So you take big pieces and create a whole bunch of small pieces, which is just as bad for us. The big pieces are actually better. We know we can get away from them. But it's the plethora of small pieces that are the ones that we're really vulnerable to. So there's lots of concepts and there's lots of things kind of in very advanced development that could look at collecting that stuff, but the physics of those problems is very challenging.
One thing that's good is in fairly low Earth orbit, a lot of stuff essentially burns up relatively quickly in a matter of years. So as the solar cycle heats up the Earth's atmosphere, it actually causes more stuff to decay and burn up, which is a good thing. We're also very focused on not generating any more debris. So all upper stages now, we either have to passivate and then try to deorbit those stages. So collectively, internationally, we have rules now of what we can leave on orbit, where we used to just leave an upper stage and it would sit around until maybe the tanks blew up or the batteries blew up and then created more debris. We now have requirements to passivate. Also in geosynchronous orbit, that's a very precise orbit where a satellite stays over a precise position. We have requirements now to move those satellites when they're at end of life. We super sync them or we put them into a deep orbit well beyond the Earth of where they're not going to be hazardous to us. So I think we're probably focused more now on the control side of not creating more debris. And we're starting to talk about the discussion of how you get it together, but it runs into all the problems that Mike just talked about.
Bill, just a quick follow-up. There's the station operates at roughly an altitude of about 250 miles up or higher, slightly, and there's a capacity to adjust the altitude with regularity. Is there an optimum kind of positioning that deals with this question, or is it kind of an irrelevant point?
We're pretty careful again about what we do around station. We've been doing a lot of CubeSat deploys, and we've been deploying those below station, so then they're not a concern from us. There's now some discussion where they would like to take some of these CubeSats in a higher orbit. If we do that, the higher orbit will then decay down through the station orbit, and we'll potentially have to maneuver. I think we've maneuvered station about 10 times throughout its lifetime. We're going to put an active sensor on the outside of station to actually monitor the active debris that hits the station. It will be a device. We will actually know what the environment is. As Mike described, the micrometeoroid debris environment, the model has recently changed. There's not as many particles as we used to think there were, at least in the model, but they're higher density, which cause more damage, which says our shielding isn't as effective. So what we've decided on the station side is, I'm tired of all these models, we're going to put some active sensors on the outside of station, and we're going to know exactly what the environment is, so then we can help with future space station design. So that's another piece that's coming. So I think the problem is we don't absolutely know. We know where the big pieces are, as Mike described. We don't know where all these little pieces are. And a little particle as small as a paint fleck, you know, it's traveling at, I don't know, 34,000 miles per hour. And so that little paint speck can go zinging right through a module or a pressure shell and cause tremendous damage. So the problem is immense. So it's paint flecks, and then there's also just micrometeoroids or small debris coming from the galaxy, and those we can't deal with. But I think if we know the environment better, we can do some things, and we're trying to do that.
Orion's test flight a year ago, just a 4.5-hour mission out 3,600 miles. And back in to re-enter, we had, I think, 7 debris hits on the capsule.
That's frequent. Harry?
I have a question.
You got
After the Columbia went down, or was destroyed, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board took a look at the shuttle history and said that the inability of the United States to come up with a replacement for the shuttle after so many years, knowing it had a finite lifetime, was a failure in national policy. Said that in quotes, and said it in italics. Are we going to repeat the same mistake? Because the space station is supposed to last till 2024. And we know it takes a long time for these big development programs to get started. If we are going to make a mistake, shouldn't the international partners on the space station put their heads together and come up with a consensus plan for the post-space station era? Or maybe it already has and we don't know it publicly.
We're doing that. and it's done. And so, no, we recognize exactly what you said, that we've got a plan for what we do beyond station, right? And it has a finite life, whatever it is, 2024, 2028. One piece we're trying to look at is low Earth orbit, and I talked to you about some of the benefits at the very beginning of station. Are any of those benefits have commercial potential? In other words, and so what we're doing in the pharmaceutical world is, typically this bone loss I described, we have a rodent models. We fly rodents to space station. You can use those to look at bone loss very quickly. In fact, it's used terrestrially in pharmaceutical labs all the time. So we've flown a device called a bone densitometer for rodents. It's a thing that fits in almost every laboratory here terrestrially. We flew it to station. So now we can give drugs to rodents, and we'll know immediately in a week whether this drug is effective for bone loss or not. And that's essentially a pass-fail criteria that a pharmaceutical company would use to do drug development before they go into the expensive FDA trials. So what we're trying to do is see if we can get the commercial industry to say, hey, there's real benefit here. There's economic potential of using this. Would they be interested enough in helping to build the next generation of station in low Earth orbit? So we're trying to use this space station to expose a commercial market to the advantages of microgravity research in terms that they can understand, with the idea that maybe someday they're willing to take over this low Earth orbit market, and it's no longer the domain of the government to do that. And the government can then do the things that are around the moon and on to Mars and these other more demanding, challenging things. So we're working very aggressively. We have the Center for Advancement of Science and Space, the CASIS organization. They use 50% of the research capability on board station just to expose commercial companies to the benefits of space. So we're working very hard to do that. We've also worked with the International Partnership to talk about what we may do beyond space station. The service module is the first piece of us working with the Europeans to bring them into exploration. Now we're looking potentially at some kind of asteroid redirect mission. That would be international. Solar electric propulsion we're looking at building, and then habitation capability to attach to Orion. Orion's good for 4 crews for 21 days in space. To go any further, you need some kind of other habitation capability. We're working with the international partners and using the station community to help us determine what that next generation of habitation should be, and we'll probably try to place that somewhere around the moon as a testing region. And the thing to not think of is, do not think of that as a space station around the moon. It is really the transportation node that will be used to go beyond the Earth-Moon system moving forward. So we're very active, and I love the partnership because we can use the space station partnership. We were able to do the service module, if you think about this, that, you know, Jean-Jacques talked to you about the IGAs and the MOUs and all these governmental documents. The blessing of those documents were they were written broad enough that I could go ahead and cut a deal with him on space station to pay his common systems ops cost for space station, but get a piece of developmental hardware for the Orion program beyond low Earth orbit and exploration. And those were all covered by those same IGAs and MOUs, because someone had enough foresight in writing those to put down the word exploration, and it didn't just stay with station, and they left them generic enough that we could use those same agreements moving forward. So we will clearly build off of what we were doing, and that is our challenge, is to put concrete plans to move forward and be ready to move.
Other comments? Question?
Come on, student questions. Come on.
What challenges do you have that you've heard today that we can help solve for you?
Here's one right there.
Several of us are currently in a project management class, and based on the definitions that this class has given us, it says that the space station project was a failure. Hold your emotion, please. It says timing, budget, things like that. Obviously, everyone up there at the table has said this is the first time we've ever done something like this in its size. How would you, each of you, or however you want to decide, how would you respond to that statement that based on an artificial budget and artificial timeline that it was a project failure?
I'd like to start off, first of all, if you examine other projects the same way, the Congressional Visitors Center would be something that you would want to put on your wall of shame, given the fact that it's terrestrially based and it was way over budget and took way too long and everything else. I think in any government program where you don't have multi-year budgets, where you have funding that is, let's say, dynamic, and it could vary from year to year, as you constrain the resources this way, if you're an experienced program manager, you know that that means that your completion date goes that way, right? Same thing with the F-35, same thing with you know, just about any major program that you undertake. The other thing is what we're being asked to do is not build a building someplace. You heard how complex this was to do. All the different engineering systems, all the different participants, the standards that are required for spaceflight are so extreme, you're going to have an awful lot of things that aren't going to work, that you're going to have to rework, because it has to be perfect when you launch it. You don't get a redo up on orbit. Okay, so I think there are a number of reasons why, and ultimately this isn't your program management question, but I think this is what we have to ask ourselves as citizens of the planet is, you know, everybody focuses, you know, with a microscope on what it cost. I think we have to look at, as Jean-Jacques said, the benefits. What is it that we gain from this? And in the grand scheme of things, I hate to say it, and I mean, I'm very conscious with my own checkbook, but $100 billion over that period of time compared to what we spend $100 billion on similar periods of time with arguably less to show for it, whether it's potato chips or pizzas or, I mean, there are a whole number of different metrics that you can use. I don't know how many pizzas that works out to be, but I do know that the annual consumption of pizza in the United States is way above NASA's annual budget, okay? I mean, just to give you an example. And so...
so is the annual expense on Easter candy.
Yeah, Easter candy, Halloween candy, but when we go out and go talk, I mean, the opportunity to communicate the benefits, I think you've heard here is a very articulate crew talking about the benefits of the International Space Station. But I think you also have to talk about what it is that NASA gets annually in terms of its appropriation compared to other things. So, for example, the high water mark when we were going to the moon, NASA gets less than a third of a tenth of the money that we use to go to the moon is what we get annually to go do this. And oh, by the way, the money isn't spent in space, it's spent here on planet Earth. It's not just spent doing space hardware, it's not just spent doing mission operations. NASA's budget goes all kinds of places to do all kinds of other science and technology that arguably has a major impact on our GDP. The products that have been derived from solving those complex challenges for the space mission are things that have remarkably improved the quality of life here on Earth. And whether it's your iPhone, no, NASA didn't invent the iPhone, but if you look at the electronics and the miniaturization of electronics and large-scale integration and things like that that had to happen, those were already there. Okay, so you didn't have to invent that. There are an awful lot of things like that, and in terms of the human body, I think some of the discoveries that are going to come from the International Space Station are going to revolutionize how we do healthcare, for example.
But I will take your project management question on, because I teach project management on the side occasionally as well, and it's a challenge to square the circle, right? Because all of those definitions of project management assume that you are given the schedule and the funding path so that you have the money at the time you need it on a normal development curve. So for 40 years, I haven't worked on one of those. And I suspect, as Bill says, that's probably more the case than what you really hear about or the courses teach you. I mean, Bill Gerst and I have had this debate for a long time, and in a sense, we're being trained to manage in flat budgets. So it's a different project management. And in some cases, if you take one ruler, you could call it a failure. You take another ruler and you could call him brilliant. Most of us call him brilliant.
Maybe one remark also, that I think that you can assess the value of a project management against objectives at start of the program. When we have started the space station, there was not a set of clear specifications. We have invented the objectives together with the development of the space station because of all what I have said. So I think that it's very difficult to assess. So I would not say if the management was a failure or a success, because we cannot evaluate that, because you can only evaluate project management against a set of clear objectives at start. And it was not a set of clear objectives. The initiative of President Reagan was not setting clear objectives. President Kennedy had a clear objective, to beat the Soviet. That is clear objective. And, but on the other hand, it was a blank check. Money was not a problem. With the space station, we had to manage a program where the objectives were not set at start. We have invented the objective together with the development of the space station. And number two, the money was constrained. And this is what our colleague has said. And this is the reason why I don't know if the management was a failure or a success. But the space station is a success. That I am convinced of that.
Yeah, I would also just add that, you know, we're just in the utilization phase. So we've got to see what comes out of this utilization phase. And this is the challenge to the community here is, you know better economic development and growth than I do. So when I describe potentially how we could get commercial companies to go operate in low Earth orbit, you can help us work on ways to do that. We could create a whole new economic sphere of where a company gains economic advantage over companies that are not doing research in space. And that gives them advantages. You could create a whole new industry out of this. This could be a Silicon Valley kind of thing. This could have huge payoffs in the future that are really untapped. But we've got to look at this not so much in hindsight. This is essentially money behind us. But now we made this investment either rightly or wrongly. Maybe we failed your program project management guidelines getting here, right? I'll take that. That's fine. But now we got this thing. How the heck can we use this moving forward? And then also, how do you put a value on some of the stuff we got out of this? The international cooperation, right? The fact that here we are having all these government-to-government sanctions between Russia and the U.S., but yet both governments have given us we're not subject to those same sanctions. So, but now there's a mechanism that the countries can actually talk to each other about, even though tensions are very high in another political arena, there's now an avenue where they can actually have a conversation in a civil manner. How do you place benefit and value on some of those things? And I think that's the things you need to think about as we move forward. The last thing I would say is, also with Scott Kelly, you know, he has his twin brother, right? And so then it turned out that they had the same genome when they were born, right? And then it changes over time. And then we said, well, we're going to have Scott in orbit and Mark on the ground. Hey, how would all you genomic researchers like to go look at this data? And I didn't have any money, so I said, you know, would you like to just get access to the data set for free? Every genomic Nobel laureate around and researcher showed up at our door, and they couldn't believe the uniqueness of this data set, because if the human genome changes in microgravity significantly different, that may give them insight into how the human genome progresses moving forward, which could blow away everything. So again, as a program project manager, I have this optimistic streak that exceeds normal bounds, but requirements, right? So I think the future is still there, but it's up to us to figure out how to creatively use this thing, and we'll set whether this is a success or failure based on what we do over the next finite number of years.
I think my experience on much of this draws from far less than what any of these four gentlemen have dedicated in their professional lives to this. As you've heard, they've spent decades at it. They're all engineers, they're all professional program managers. I just had the privilege to stop by for 4 years as part of the community. But what I came away from was a clear understanding that there's a real problem making determinations on points like this, because it always assumes that if you've made a determination that it's taken more time and cost more, that you assume you knew how long it should have taken and knew how much it would cost at the time that you began the undertaking. Almost every one of those kinds of statements are derived from benchmarking, prior experience, some frame of reference, whatever, that then gives you a relative understanding of how to accurately, or come close to accurately make a determination like that. In each and every program I ever saw in this community, more often than not, as in like 95% of the time, nothing had precursed this. There was no benchmark. No one had ever tried it before. They were doing it for the first time. So it came to me as a bean counter by background, a financial manager, that the only way that you could arrive at any understanding of this, to put a benchmark out there to say this is what it might run, is to guess. And then you're gauged for the rest of time based on the guesstimate that was made by some unknown person on some unknown date, and you're pilloried for it for decades thereafter. It is just incredible. So therefore, I would have refrained from guessing. And that's basically what got, I think, a lot of challenge that was brought to this. But for every one of those instances, the most compelling argument is the one Bill Gerstenmaier just argued, which is the full frame of reference of these things are then evaluated in the fullness of time after you see what the benefits are that could be derived. The Hubble Space Telescope is a classic circumstance and point. It was longer than it should have taken. It cost more to get up there. It finally got deployed. And by the time they got it into the right orbit, it turned out it was blind. A telescope that's blind. Now, there's handy. And it needed a LASIK surgery that a graduate of Syracuse University was the primary astronaut for being aboard. It was Story Musgrave was the primary guy who went up there and did it by hand to adjust this thing to do a LASIK surgery on a telescope. All of it cost money, all of it cost time, all of it delayed, and by any program management standard, it was a failure. Today, it's considered to be the darling of the scientific community. It's given us discoveries we never dreamed of being capable of understanding. And it's lasted considerably longer than anybody estimated, ever. And at many intervals, it was estimated to die like tomorrow. And somehow managed to just get its way through, and it still operates today. And as a consequence, that is a stunning achievement that no one would have ever guessed on. And if anybody had proclaimed it as being capable of what it would actually do, the answer would have been, you're being delusional and you're overselling the program. And that's precisely the way it would have been judged at the time. So, every one of these steps, I think, are extremely difficult to kind of work through. They're hard to defend. And if you had to define the ultimate challenge of leadership, it's this. In the face of that kind of determination, with no background whatsoever, no means to make a historical frame of reference to any of it, and have any other idea what anybody's ever tried ever before that rose anywhere near to the same level of it, you're then judged by that standard, and your task is to try to find a way to justify that with continued challenge. And that was the greatest circumstance. I was struck by, and I'll close with this, and I want to thank all the panelists and to Jean-Jacques Dordain as well particularly for making the trip to come join us and be part of the community for the time that he has. He made one very profound comment at the earlier portion of his presentation, that in 1969, the competition ended. We figured out who the winner was, and everyone then lost interest. Until the next time there was something of interest. And at each one of these levels, what his, I think, very insightful observation was, that I hadn't thought about this way till he said it, was that it's in that atmosphere that you learn how to cooperate, how you have to develop cooperative efforts. And for global participation to be the essential element of what's going to bring that further and continue its progress. And that, I think, is the message that comes from so much of what I think we've heard here this afternoon. Please come join us for a reception in the Eggers Commons, which will be opening in a matter of moments. And we thank you all for your attendance, participation, and to all the panelists, thank you, gentlemen. You're great. Appreciate it.